Good afternoon. Our next presenter is Joe Pizarchik. Joe Pizarchik earned a Bachelor, a BA from the Pennsylvania State University and a JD from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock School of Law in Arkansas. He has worked in the private sector and as a lawyer for the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and the Department of Environmental Protection. At DEP, he served as program counsel for the mining program and as director of the Bureau of Mining and Reclamation. From November 2009 through January 2017, he served as President Obama's director of the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, Department of the Interior. He is the principal of Pizarchik Advancement and works with NGOs, state agencies, national organizations, the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, and members of Congress, etc., to advance the treatment of acid mine drainage, reforestation of former mines, and to address other adverse effects of mining. Please join me in welcoming Joe.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to F-Camera and Rec-Camera and everybody else who has made this conference possible. It's much appreciated. There's a need and the sharing of a lot of information. As the program indicates, I'm here to talk about some opportunities for leadership to address the needs for long-term funding of operation, maintenance, rehabilitation of acid mine drainage treatment systems, in particular systems that treat acid mine drainage from abandoned coal mines. To give you a little bit of background before I get into some of that, I want to point out to folks that where Pennsylvania has been a leader, has been the first in the nation, if not the world, on a number of accomplishments it dealt with in regards to acid mine drainage. Pennsylvania was the first state to treat abandoned mine land discharges, acid mine drainage from abandoned coal mines. That started back in the 1960s with Operation Scarlet. For more information, you can go to the BAMA website, and they have a little bit of a history on Operation Scarlet. A number of those treatment facilities were still in existence today, and there is another area where Pennsylvania was one of the first in the country. It deals with requiring coal companies who created acid mine drainage as part of their mining operations to treat their assets, to treat their pollution. Just a little bit of history. Back when the Clean Streams Law was first enacted in the 1930s, it provided that coal companies were exempt from having to get a permit or having to treat the acid that they created until such time as it became technologically possible to treat it. In the 1960s, that technology existed, the law was changed, and coal companies in Pennsylvania were required to treat the acid that they had created on their mines, and they were given a year to start treating or to get out of the business. Some jobs got out of the business, some treated it. Another area where Pennsylvania was the first, and this one was a little more unofficial, no necessary statute on that. I believe, from what I understand, it was one of the first states to prohibit the issuance of permits to coal mines in watersheds that had not yet been adversely impacted by coal mining. And that was done by one of my predecessors, where the bureau director, when the permit application came in for a permit to mine in one of those watersheds, that permit application went into a filing cabinet. And under what was known as the Guckert rule, it stayed in that filing cabinet and was never issued. So that's why we have some streams in Pennsylvania where there is coal, but they are high quality or exceptional value streams due to the initiative of that bureau director. Pennsylvania also became the first state to deny permits that would produce acid mine drainage. A lot of that goes back to some of the folks who work for DEP, who studied at Penn State and learned about acid-base accounting, and that aspect of it led to the first in the nation, I believe, if not the world, on how to determine whether proposed coal mining would create long-term water pollution. And once those folks started implementing that, with the acid-based accounting, et cetera, the failure rate on permits that were issued in Pennsylvania that generated acid mine drainage went from about 20% down to about 1% or less. That was a significant improvement, and the people who were working on that, some of them were recognized worldwide as leaders in dealing with acid mine drainage. People like Keith Brady, Roger Hornberger, Mike Smith, et cetera. Another area, I think, where Pennsylvania was the leader, and I'm going through all this to try to set the stage because we have opportunities to also be the first to figure out how to pay for long-term operation and maintenance of these treatment facilities that we have. And Pennsylvania was the first state to allow remining of sites that had an existing acid mine drainage discharge. That was done in the 80s. Took a lot of persuasion, et cetera, to convince EPA to allow that because they were very skeptical of it. With the expertise that DEP had, they knew that there were some sites that could be remined to either eliminate or reduce the acid mine drainage that existed, was caused by previous coal mining. And that effort was successful. It led to Pennsylvania creating a separate new rules, regulations, subchapter F in it. And that model was so successful and impressive that Congressman Rahal from West Virginia amended the Federal Surface Mining Act to include it to allow other states to do that. So another example of where Pennsylvania was leading in the acid mine drainage world on that and was followed by others. The state was also the leader in eliminating acid mine drainage from waste coal piles at virtually no cost to the government. That was started, I think, sometime in the early to mid-90s. And Pennsylvania, you heard earlier with the presentation about where they permitted the site up near Indiana County. And they were remining the site, got a remining permit, and hauled off the waste coal, the coal refuse, and brought the alkaline ash back. I think went from, basically it was about a 10% reduction in volume on that, but a much more significant reduction in acid, et cetera. Well, there were hundreds of refuse piles abandoned in Pennsylvania that were a lot smaller, and the economics of the value of that waste coal was not there to sustain the cost or to cover the cost of getting a permit to remine those sites. And there were a small number of people within DEP who wanted to get rid of those sites, so they created a new program to allow that waste coal to be removed from the site, and the only amount of alkaline ash that would come back would be the amount that was necessary to neutralize the soil in order to be able to get the revegetation established. So hundreds of those were done on that, and eventually the federal government, OSMR, came along and modified their regulations, created new rules that became the AML enhancement rule, where the goal was to address acid mine drainage or some other problems. The states could do that via a contract, and with coal waste being priority 3, most of those piles were not being addressed by the AML program due to the way the law was written and the limited resources that were available to the states. Another area where Pennsylvania was the first, and I believe is still the only one, it was an Environmental Good Samaritan Act that was enacted in Pennsylvania to provide protection to landowners, volunteers, and folks who undertook the treatment of abandoned mine discharges on that, entities, contractors, coal companies who provided resources, et cetera. And I don't believe there's any other state in the country that has that. There have been some attempts, but again, Pennsylvania led the way on that, and that also has been successful in helping to get acid mine drainage problems addressed in Pennsylvania. There was another area more recently after that is calculating the bond to ensure that when the coal company failed, that the state had enough money to perpetually treat the discharge. DEP had struggled with that for a couple of decades, and at one point there was director of district mining operations, who wanted to figure out how to do that. And Pennsylvania worked, and I believe was the first state in the country to figure out how to calculate how much bond was needed to treat the discharge basically forever. And at that particular point, they were moving forward that, but they also recognized that when you calculated the bonds posted, it is a static instrument. What I mean by that, the bond sits there, it doesn't earn any interest, it doesn't grow, and every 5 years you have to update it to adjust for inflation, et cetera, so that when the company goes out of a business, and based on the data that DEP had at that time, very few coal companies lasted more than 50 years. Most of them failed before that or went out of business, so they knew they needed to have adequate bonds to address those discharges. And part of figuring that out, one of the things DEP realized that it would be very expensive to put that net present value in because the money was stagnant. And they also decided to create a program that would allow a coal company to establish an irrevocable trust, which means once the money was put in by the coal company, they could not get the money back without approval from DEP. And that, again, was the first program of that in the country to do that. The advantage of them doing the trust was that the net present value of the money today to perpetually treat it was less than if it was a bond, because that trust fund money could be invested in the stocks and bonds. DEP based the program that it created on the long-term history of bonds, because there were records of how much money bonds earned or stocks earned going back prior to the Great Depression. So we pulled all that information together to do it. As part of working with the first coal company that we were trying to get put full cost bond up, it was for 5 discharges out near Indian Creek in Somerset County. And as we were meeting with them, every time we would get together, the coal company would change number. What if this cost changed or that cost changed? And DEP, we'd have to go back and recalculate it. And we realized we needed some kind of a software in order to facilitate that. DEP had hired a contractor to prepare that. Long story short, we went to one of the meetings, we had our laptop there, slides, etc. When the coal company said, what if you change that? And staff click, 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 made the changes on it, and they got the new number. And what about this or that? Asked to borrow it for the weekend. That was the first version of AMD tree on that. And when the DEP program person, Jeff Jarrett, left Pennsylvania to go become the OSMR director, he took that with him, got West Virginia involved, and eventually the United States Geologic Survey got involved, and it's been updated repeatedly. And one of the big things, since we were developing that with public money, we wanted to make it available to anybody for free, and that's why it's out there. The last I heard, it was in use in more than a dozen countries around the world. With creating those treatment trusts, again, we did that, and one of the other things that we were working on, again, it was Pennsylvania leadership, was when the bipartisan infrastructure law, President Biden's infrastructure law, the IIJA, also known as, was drafted, did not specifically allow money to be set aside for operation and maintenance and rehabilitation. We tried, worked with Senator Casey and others to get that, but we could not get a Republican senator to co-sponsor it, so the bill was passed without that, in which case we then worked with Senator Casey, as well as Congressman Matt Cartwright from up in the anthracite region, and we drafted and eventually got input from the states and from Interior to what became the STREAM Act, and through the leadership of the Pennsylvania delegation with Casey and Cartwright bringing others in to get it co-sponsored, we got it introduced, and then when the omnibus bill was passed shortly before Christmas of 2022, that was enacted as well. The reason why I'm raising all this is it's important to understand that there's been about more than $140 million invested in Pennsylvania in building these treatment facilities. Pennsylvania has more treatment facilities, more than 340, than any other state in the country. Maybe half of the treatment facilities in the United States are in Pennsylvania. But when you make that kind of investment in that infrastructure, you need to also be making an investment to ensure it's maintained and preserved and rebuilt when necessary. And while there's been money over the years to build these, there really wasn't money put in place to ensure the operation maintenance, particularly the ones that were built by NGOs, local governments, et cetera. The other thing that was interesting in the infrastructure bill, it for the first time characterized clean water, mine drainage treatment facilities, if you will, or clean water and productive land as infrastructure. We've been arguing for a while that if you don't have clean water, you don't have productive land, you're not going to really be able to do much of anything out there. And so with the investments that we made, we wanted to have that investment protected, that infrastructure protected. Continuing with Pennsylvania leadership, Pennsylvania through Bamber was the first state to submit their STREAM Act 30% set aside program amendment to the federal government. They're still waiting approval of that, and we are hopeful that that'll happen sometime in the not too distant future. Now get into more of the substance of it as to some of the opportunities that exist for some continued Pennsylvania leadership in this area. Under this first one, what I am laying out is DEP, Pennsylvania, could use the rulemaking process, the process whereby they adopt regulations. They could adopt regulations for the AML program to create an abandoned mine land, acid mine drainage, set-aside trust account. Now, that sounds like it would be new and complicated, but not really. It can be a little complicated. It would be new from the standpoint for abandoned mine land discharges, but back in the mid-2000s, the late 2000s, Pennsylvania used the rulemaking process to create alternative bonding system legacy sites trust account. Those are sites there where under the former alternative bonding system where coal companies did not have to post a full cost bond, so surface coal mines, and they forfeited. There were discharges, I believe about 100 discharges out there, and we used the rulemaking process to set up 2 trust accounts to generate money and another one for the long term on that. That model could be used by DEP to create a trust account through the rulemaking process, and I've cited the legal authority that the state could use to support such a rulemaking. If Pennsylvania chooses to do that, right, sorry about that, but there are certain advantages if you create the trust, set-aside trust account. One, by doing the rulemaking process, a regulation properly adopted in Pennsylvania has the force of law. Pretty much close to the equivalent of what was passed by the legislature. It makes it that much more enforceable. That is also important to do a trust account because it protects the money from misuse. I'll digress a little bit on what misuse is. In my experience in state and federal government, anytime you have a pot of money sitting around for a dedicated purpose, it can tempt elected officials, political appointees, etc., to try to take that money and use it for some other purpose. By putting it into a trust account on it, anybody who has an interest in that clean water, whether you're fishing downstream for one of those sites, you're bringing water out for your livestock, or for agriculture purposes, or any other purposes, you're swimming in that stream because it's not polluted. Under case law in Pennsylvania, if somebody tries to take that money, you can sue the government or anybody else, and based on the case law, I believe you will be successful in prohibiting that money from being diverted to some other purpose. Could be a worthwhile purpose, but because it's in the trust account and under case law, it would be protected. The other advantage with the using the rulemaking process to it, as we heard from Tom Clark earlier today, about some of the concerns that the the feds were having with the set-aside accounts. This process would allow the state to get input from the feds and the public and other people, and you could craft regulations to address those needs of Pennsylvania and those concerns of the federal government. The possibility that you might be able to craft it in a way that allows a higher rate of investment of those funds than the state treasurer typically can do when it collects forfeited money that has to go into the state treasury on from forfeited bonds. Second opportunity. Can you go to the next screen? The second opportunity, again, this is for operation and maintenance, is the state could create a long-term treatment trust fund itself. We crafted a form that was used to allow coal companies to establish the treatment trusts for discharges they created. We could follow that model, but retailer it, DEP could retailer it for the AML part of it, and instead of having the coal company establish the trust using the department forms, they could have some nonprofit entity that has a good track record, like, for instance, maybe the Foundation for the Pennsylvania Watersheds, to create that trust fund, and then it would be invested. You have the licensed trustees operating and investing that money. Trustees in Pennsylvania typically are not going to want to do anything that could expose them to liability under state superfund laws, etc. So what the program that was set up by Pennsylvania some years ago for active mine could be used here, whereas DEP could work with the entity holding that trust, if it was FPW, for example, and they could set up a program to have checks and balances in it, when to hire contractors to go out to do the reclamation or the restoration of the system, when to do the operation, maintenance of it, all of those things. And that would also reduce the workload on DEP and have it, the money in this irrevocable trust, but again, would protect that money from being diverted by other folks on that and ensure that it's there for the long term. And in our experience, most discharges are basically there forever. Now, some water quality will change and improve, but not all of them on that. So this is another opportunity where Pennsylvania could lead the country in ensuring that money is put in place and is protected from being diverted for other uses by any entity on it. On to the, well, that's not working so well.
Sorry.
On to the next one, there's a third opportunity, and under this particular one, suggestion is a slightly different approach. I believe DEP, Pennsylvania has the authority. They could solicit a grant application or a contract proposal to use the infrastructure AML funds to operate and maintain AMD treatment facilities for multiple years. And what I mean by that is an appropriate entity could submit an application if DEP is soliciting and amenable to that, where they could propose to perform operation and maintenance of existing treatment facilities for a specific number of years. My understanding under Pennsylvania law, the longest term that they can have for a contract is 5 years, but it's still, that's 5 times more than nothing, which we have right now for those systems. So there would be opportunity to do that, whether it's on a watershed basis, a drainage basis, or specific passive treatment systems. I believe the more you put in that, you get economies of scale. It would clearly be within the authority under state and federal law. I think OSMR should be on board with that as well. Again, all of these things would have to get input from the state agency and the federal government, and that could be done. Now, if you look at this one, again, I list the legal authority. This one's slightly different. You're not going to be able to do the rehabilitation of the systems because of the solicitors at Interior a year or so ago had involved and had pointed out that there was another federal law that prohibited the use of the money to be set aside or for rehabilitation. But if using But under the existing law, as it was passed by Congress, without any amendments for the President's bipartisan infrastructure law, there is enough authority out there to do these type of contracts for those 5-year periods. And that could take you well into 20, 21 years after the infrastructure law was passed, because it's going for 15 years. If the final appropriation from that grant comes in on the 16th year, you have that. There's also provisions in that law for distributing the money that any states weren't able to use. It's too early to plan for that, but we should keep that in the back of our mind, because Pennsylvania's got more need than is going to be coming in that. There might be an opportunity to get some of that money in the future as well. Again, laid out the legal authority for that option. Again, these are opportunities for Pennsylvania to lead the country on how to ensure this clean water infrastructure is preserved and continues to function, as well as the money being protected. A fourth option is something that a former OSMR director, Robert Urim, had identified. Under his analysis of the infrastructure law, with which I agree to it, the AML grant funds could be used to fund operation maintenance for the life of a project through a state-held non-wasting endowment or trust. This isn't just something he dreamed up. He examined the law, and based on his work in Washington, he is familiar with the Army Corps of Engineers doing a similar thing for preserving and maintaining wetlands that were provided under wetland mitigation projects to ensure that those wetlands continue to exist. And again, the citations there for the Army Corps regulations. It is, I believe, possible for Interior to adopt a regulation using their existing authority under SMACRA, particularly Title IV, as well as Stream Act, and I think they could authorize something like this to be set up so that a trust could be established for the operation and maintenance of that treatment facility or that specific treatment facility on that. Again, an option that is out there would take some work, but again, anything worthwhile is worth working for. I believe that's the case under any of these opportunities. Some additional suggestions I have for a long-term OM&R go a little bit beyond setting the money aside. One of them is to ensure that once the site treatment facility is built, that there are funds and access so people can continue to make sure that site is available for treatment and is continued to be operated. And that can be done in a number of different ways. One, you could include conservation easements in with the property so that that property is continued to be available. Other covenants that run with the land, somewhat similar to conservation easements. Or you can make sure that the ownership of that treatment facility and the land in which it's on is covered, owned by a nonprofit entity or there's an easement accessing to that facility is owned by it. To give you a non-AML example of that, back when DEP created the bond forfeiture trust fund programs, or the trust on that, once the site was completely reclaimed, except for the obligation, the reclamation obligation to treat their discharge for as long as it existed, DEP developed a policy that coal companies could then apply for final bond release on the rest of the permit that was not needed for the treatment facility to access the treatment facility or provide electric or chemicals to it. That part would still stay under permit and would be there so that the coal company or its successor or DEP through its inspection program could be out there to make sure that that treatment system continued to function, was in existence. So that's a slightly different context, but the example is relevant from the standpoint, you build these systems, you want to be able to make sure that you can operate and maintain them, and listed a number of things here to deal with that. Other recommendation I would make in this regard is regarding the existing treatment systems. Some of them were built quite a while ago where the technology was not as advanced as it is today, and they may not be treating and removing as much pollutants as we know we can do today. So when you're rehabilitating one of these systems, don't just rebuild what was built 10, 20 years ago or so. Use the best available passive treatment technology today to build it in order to get more water or cleaner water out of it, remove more of the pollutants. I'm advocating that, one, not only for the environmental and water quality benefit of it, but also so that if anybody ever decides to try to sue over the water quality coming from one of these, if you've got your iron down to 2 or 1 milligram per liter, you got your pH between 6 and 9, unless it's going into an acidic stream where you could go higher on that, then they're not going to have any grounds to sue under federal law. The Good Samaritan Act would protect people if those projects were done under Pennsylvania's Environmental Good Samaritan Act, but you still have that federal component out there. And it's just a way of continuing to advance the science and to do a better job in that particular area. Again, that best available passive treatment technology, that's not a regulatory standard, that's a concept I helped create with John Dawes and Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, but we know we could do better in that particular area. We should take that opportunity to do that, and in future systems, make sure that when you're rehabilitating them or getting contracts to build them or rehabilitate them, include in the contract specifications that the system will function and achieve the water quality targets you set. That helps also ensure that the money is properly used for these systems, and you don't have somebody coming in who think they know what they're doing but are not experienced in building acid mine drainage treatment systems. You want it to be able to function the way it's intended and get the water quality that is possible. With that, I'll open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
Great presentation, Joe. And can you go back to option 1 real quick? And then just a comment for Joe and the group. Joe mentioned how we amended our 2022 BIL grant to amend it to apply the STREAM Act. Yes, we're still waiting for that. I'd like to follow up to let everybody know at the end of August, we applied for our 2023 BIL grant as well. And in that grant application, we did apply for the full 30% of the STREAM Act. So OSM has 2 applications in the queue. The 2022, it was amended for 30% of the 244.9, it's roughly 70 million to go into the new, what I call STREAM Act set aside. They call it the AML BIL long-term fund. And then additionally, the 2023 grant application already has us applying for the full 30%. So we are waiting on that from OSM. And the last thing we do know, we have to provide a legal opinion letter to do so, and that's the next thing. But thank you for these 4 opportunities for us to evaluate, Joe.
And when you're putting that legal letter together, to look at the legal analysis, the STREAM Act, in my opinion, provides authority to do that, as does Title IV of federal SMACRA. It's some pretty broad authority. In my state and federal experience, there are folks who let's just say are uncomfortable or reticent to acknowledge the states have that authority. Within the state, there are some folks who believe that DEP can only do what it is authorized by a statute that created it to do. And there can be some merit to that. It's never been tested. One of the program AML amendments Pennsylvania submitted some years ago went ahead, even though there was reservation in the DEP legal offices on that. But my view is that the governor also has even more extensive powers than the DEP. So if you can get the governor to sign off on that letter, or the general counsel on behalf of the governor say legally you can do that. And then one thing we have not used in the past, which with more recent court decisions in Pennsylvania, Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution, the Environmental Amendment, I believe provides very broad authority for the state that would support this, because the state is working to ensure that the waters of the Commonwealth, which belong to the Commonwealth, can be preserved for present and future generations. And that is a very powerful part, and the composition of Pennsylvania Supreme Court, I think, would support that if anyone were challenged, I would say would support that being included. Again, I'm advocating from outside, but having been with the state and Osmond on that, I think the authority is there.
Yep, definitely appreciate it. We are definitely in a legal interpretation right here, right now. We have a legal counsel doing what we can to communicate with solicitors of OSM.
Great. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Joe, I agree with most of what you said. However, this issue with, let's say, privatizing set-aside has come up before. My first kind of thought is that, of course, if you put in higher risk investments, you also have the ability to lose money. So you would have to structure such investments so that you couldn't lose principal at key moments. And then the second kind of comment would be, who gets the administration fund? Every fund that I've ever seen, somebody takes 0.5% or something for the admin and management of that trust. How does that privatize? Because if you take the $74 million we're going to be able to set aside each year, run that over the life of the bill, I want that job. I'll gladly take the 5% of $1 billion every year.
I appreciate that comment, raises some good points. When I was with DEP and we were creating the trust documents for the long-term operation and maintenance of treatment facilities on permitted sites, we evaluated that, and if you look at the consent order agreement that DEP drafted and the trust agreement that it drafted, it has provisions in it that limits the ratio of how much of that trust account can be invested in stocks and how much can be invested in bonds. And we also went back and looked at the history of the stocks and bond market from pre-Great Depression, figuring that there might be another one, and we came close to that with the Great Recession some years ago. But we also built in a cushion on how much money had to be in there, and if it fell below a certain amount, then the coal company would have to put more money into that account. However, if there was excess money in there, the coal company wouldn't get it back unless the coal company could prove to the department's satisfaction that the quality had changed or their costs had changed enough so they would come down. So you're going to risk some loss and some gains. There were people who thought that the way those trusts were being operated, that it was losing too much money. We've got the Pennsylvania Secretary of Banking to do a review of that, and the investment in the trust funds within the parameters that DEP had established for those trusts existing performed better than any investment firm on the stock market and the bond market is doing. So we try to take care of that. So there's risk there, no doubt. If you want to have lower risk, then you put more money into bonds than stocks. And I think we limited that the most you could have in bonds or stock, I think was maybe 80% and maybe 20 on that. But again, you can adjust it what's your risk aversion is not. As far as the cost, administration costs, that is something you definitely want to look at. And if you were to put money all in one trust that had one trustee operating that and somebody or a contractor, if you will, administering that, I think you have the opportunity to structure it in a way that maybe it's 0.5% up to a certain point, but then it continues to drop. Or you establish more than one of these so you don't have that high amount attract that kind of desire to pocket all that money without the administrative cost on it. Now, if you have that money in there, you're going to have that person with that trust or that entity with that trust, excuse me, they're going to need to be doing some things to help out, like hiring contractors, et cetera. So there are going to be expenses that they're going to have to incur in order to put that money to use to maintain and operate those systems. So it's not 100% clear on that, but those are factors that I think you can take into consideration and make your judgment on what you think is best at this point. If you take something more conservative, that's okay. And why we did that was back in the 90s, the state treasury was very, very limited in what you could do with the money. And when the bond was forfeited by state law, it goes into the state treasury, and therefore you needed to have a lot more money up front to ensure it was there. If you do something a little more aggressive, maybe the state laws have changed since I've been there, and that the treasurer is allowed to invest in things that earn a higher rate of return, but that's something to think about as well. Any other questions? Good, we're out of time. Thank you very much.